Hello and welcome to the CEBRA Inflation Drivers and Dynamics webinar series. My name is Dominic Smith and I'm one of the organizers of this webinar series on behalf of the Central Bank Research Association. Rafael Schunla is the other co-organizer, and without much ado, let me pass the virtual stage to Ina Hajdini, research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, who will be today's moderator.
Thank you, Dominic, and hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be moderating today's session. The topics of today's session are monopsony power and the transmission of monetary policy and sticky continuing tenant rents. Of course, special thanks to the organizers, Rafael Schunla and Dominic Smith. Before we get started, let me go over a few details on the webinar format. So the webinar is 45 minutes in total with two presentations of approximately 15 minutes each, and a 10 to 15 minutes Q&A session at the very end. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio and video, but are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. You can, of course, post your questions during the presentations already and do not have to wait until the very end. I will then select questions to be answered in the Q&A session of the webinar after the presentations. The webinar is also live streamed via the CEBRA YouTube channel, recorded and made available on the CEBRA website and CEBRA YouTube channel after the event. And finally, as a disclaimer, participation in a CEBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a CEBRA or CEBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of CEBRA and the co-sponsoring institutions or any other participating institution. Without further ado, let me now introduce our two speakers. Our first presenter is Sergio Salgado. He is an assistant professor of finance at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. And today he'll be talking about monopsony power and the transmission of monetary policy. And the second presenter for today is Randy Verbrugge. He's my colleague and the senior research economist at the Cleveland Fed. And today he'll be talking about sticky continuing tenant rents. Without further ado, let me now pass on the virtual stage to Sergio. Sergio, whenever you're ready, you can share your slides.
All right. All right. Everything is okay. Everything looks good. All right. Thank you. So to just start, or all right.
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
Thank you, all the organizers, for inviting me to present. It's a pleasure to be here. This is a joint work with Ben Spardonsky at the Fed and Gideon Borstein, my colleague here at Wharton. And of course, there is a disclaimer. We use data from the census, so whatever we say has nothing to do with what the census opinions is. It's the same thing for the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. It's just our opinion and our work. Now, the motivation of this paper is the large concentration of labor markets at the local level. So it's not surprised that local labor markets in the United States are highly concentrated. For instance, 1/3 of all workers employed by firms in local labor markets are employed in firms whose wage share within the labor market is more than 10%. Here, local labor market is defined as a subsector, an IX3, for instance, within a county, within a state, right? So the question that we have in this paper is how the presence of labor market power affect the transmission of monetary policy. And to answer the question, we're going to do two things. First, we're going to provide evidence of the heterogeneous response of firms with differential labor market power to monetary policy shocks. And given that evidence, we're going to construct a neo-Keynesian model with heterogeneous oligopolistical firms to evaluate the impact of monetary policy and how the changes of the monopsony power in the United States over the last 40 years changes the transmission of monetary policy. So to do the first bit, we're going to use administrative census data at the quarterly frequency from the LEHD dataset. And using this data and some definitions that I'm going to give you later, we're going to study the heterogeneous response of firms with high and low monopsony labor market power to a monetary policy shock. I'm going to define that in a little bit. Now, the main finding of the empirical part of our paper is that low monopsony power firms that in general have a lower share of the employment within a local labor market, are significantly more responsive to a monetary policy shocks in terms of the wage bill that they pay and the employment that they hire within the local labor market. So the second part of the paper, given this evidence, we're going to build an heterogeneous firms neo-Keynesian model where firms compete within local labor market oligopolistically. And I'm going to show you a very simple example in which, absent of wage stickiness, the fact that there is markdowns and there is local labor market power is irrelevant for the transmission of monetary policy. In fact, absent of wage stickiness, there will be an homogeneous response to a monetary policy shock despite the presence of heterogeneous markdowns. So you need the combination of both wage stickiness and heterogeneity, both to get different transmissions and to match or to account for the heterogeneity I'm going to show you earlier in the empirical results. Now we're going to calibrate the model. This is the part that is more work in progress to the evidence that I'm going to show you, right? And we're going to study the implications of the monopsony power for the transmission of monetary policy. So in our model, if you completely kill the fact that firms have labor market power, you will increase the efficacy of the monetary policy. The fact that there is labor market power reduces the elasticity of output to a monetary policy shock in 40%. Now we can do, that is one of the counterfactuals. The second counterfactor that we do is that we know that at the local level, labor market power seems to have decreased since the 1980s. There is some question about what is happening at the aggregate level. Our evidence and some other papers' evidence shows that at the local labor market power, monopsony power seems to have declined. So just by that fact, using our model, we can say that today, when local labor power is lower relative to the 1980s, monetary policy is 16% more effective, meaning the elasticity is 16%. The elasticity of output relative to a monetary policy shock is 16% higher. All right, so let me jump directly to the empirical analysis to show you some cute pictures. So on the data side, we're going to use LEHD, which is a match employer-employee panel data set for the population of firms and workers in different states. We have information in our data set of 23 states, including large states such as California, New York, and Pennsylvania, but we don't have information, for instance, of other large states like Texas, Illinois, or Florida. Our data starts in 1994 and extends to 2021, but for all extent and purposes in the results that I'm going to show you now, I'm going to exclude the pandemic. So we are going to stop in 2019. And using this data, we're going to construct quarterly wage bill and employment of a particular firm within a local labor market. And a local labor market is going to be a combination of an X3 and a county. So let's say the same company may appear twice in our data set because the same company may have high labor market power, let's say in rural Minnesota. Let's say thinking maybe, I don't know, Walmart in Morris, Minnesota. Maybe it's the only supermarket there. But in Minneapolis, may have lower labor market power because it's there is competing with Target and with Costco and some other retailers. So the same firm may appear in different local labor market powers, having different, they may appear in different labor markets, having differential labor market. To measure monetary policy shock, we're going to use the Jarochinsky and Karady shocks that try to disentangle the true monetary policy shock from Fred information. We use different shocks. I will show you some pictures. We're not very particular to this particular type of shock, but this is the one that we're going to use in our main analysis. All right. So using this data, we're going to classify firms in two groups. We're going to say a firm has a high degree of labor market within a subsector county if this firm accounts for more than 10% of the wage bill within this sector. And I'm going to call that firm in that particular subsector a high monopsony power firm. That is my threshold there. And all the rest of the firms are going to be called low labor market power. And then I'm going to just simply run a local projection in which in the left-hand side, I'm going to put either the log wage bill or the log employment. And in the right-hand side, I'm going to put a monetary policy shock, the MP here, interacted with a dummy that tells me whether this firm is high or low local labor market power, right? According to my threshold. And the important parameter here is going to be this beta that's going to capture the differential response of low labor market power firms relative to high labor market power firms here, or low monopsony power firms relative to high monopsony power firms. Here we're controlling for some lag values of inflation, unemployment, and GDP, and also some lag values of the dependent variable. We have fixed effects at the sector level, state level, and group. And I'm also going to control for some firm characteristics. And in each case, I'm going to interact these characteristics, such as the age of the firm, the size of the firm, or whether it has some monopoly power, which I'm going to define in a second, interacted with also with the monetary policy shock. So the one that we care is this beta, which is this differential response. So in this plot, I show you what is that beta parameter along my local projection. So what this is saying is that in terms of the wage bill, low monopsony power firms are more responsive to the same monetary policy shock related to high monopsony power firms. In terms of magnitudes, at quarter 8, low monopsony power firms are around 50% more responsive than the high monopsony power firm. That is in terms of the wage bill. In terms of employment, the response is more muted, but it's still significantly larger for those firms that have low monopsony power firm. In terms of magnitudes, again, at quarter 8, firms that have low monopsony power are around 15% more responsive to the same monetary policy shock than firms that have high monopsony power within the labor market. Now, the results are robust to a battery of examples and changes that we have been running inside the census. Here I'm showing you only 4. I will describe it in a second. Inside the census and the RDC, we have 20 more. Happy to keep talking about those later in the Q&A. So you may concern that this is only, it's not about monopsony power, maybe it's about the age of the firm. We know that younger firms may be more responsive to aggregate shocks in general, in particular to monetary policy shock. If you control by age or by size or both at the same time, you get basically the same response. Maybe you may concern that this is not about monopsony power with respect to workers, but monopoly power with respect to what these firms are selling. We can sort of control for this monopoly power by defining firms that have a significant share of a significant sales share in a particular sector. If you control for that, you get the sample is smaller because we're using data from LBDR. We can talk about that later, but the results are relatively similar. If you don't like the Karinsky and Karady shocks, we can do it with Bauer and Swanson. Or if you don't like this definition of the 10% for defining a local labor market, we can separate firms according to the Herfindahl index of the local labor market when they are competing. And if you divide these above the median and below the median in terms of the Herfindahl index, you get more or less the same result. So this result is quite robust for different specification and holds for also for other things. Commuting zone, if you control for national size rather than the size within the labor market, if you have a more granular definition of monopsony power, if you control for the characteristics of the worker, so on and so forth, everything looks pretty similar to the plot that I showed you before. All right. So hopefully I have convinced you that monetary policy is heterogeneous across firms with different local labor market power, right? It is significantly larger for those firms that have low labor market. Conditional on this, let me show you, use 5 to 4 minutes to just tell you what are we doing in the model. So the model that we have is a discrete time infinite horizon model. There is a representative household and monopolistically competitive firms, right? The important bit is that there is a continuum of local labor markets, right? Defined by J in this case, but within each local labor market, there is a finite number of firms. And these firms compete for workers a la Bertrand. Now, the important part here is that besides price stickiness for the firm, for these firms, the important bit is that there is wage stickiness. Firms, when they decide what wage to place there to attract workers, they don't know when it's going to be the next time that they can change their wages. So I'm not going to go into detail in the problem of the household. The problem of the household is quite standard. The important part is that solving the problem of this household deliver the labor supply that depends both on the wage within the local labor market, right, the IJT, and the wage across labor markets, And it depends on both elasticity of the labor supply within labor markets, the eta, and the elasticity across labor markets. This is just quite standard, and it's just the solution of the problem of the house. The problem that is more interesting is the problem of the firm that can change the wage in a particular period. And just to take things on time, let me just show you directly what is the solution of this problem. The solution of this problem is a wage that depends on three things. Depends on the fact that the firm, every time that decide what wage to post in a particular labor market, is looking into the future, because it need to decide or need to pick a wage, considering that it might not be, it might need to change the wage only in certain periods in the future and not all in every single period. And this is this Calvo shock that you see here, the theta. It also depends on the marginal revenue product, right? That depends on both the productivity of the firm, which is fixed, and the monetary policy shock, and depends on this guy that is going to define the markdown. And the markdown, importantly, depends on the wage bill share of this company or this firm within the labor market. So let me show you one analytical result, and then I will show you the quantitative result. What I want you guys to get is that the markdown these firms get is increasing in the share that this firm has within the local labor market. At the limit, if these firms are very small, right, the share is close to zero, they only care about the elasticity within the labor market. And if this firm is very big, the share is close to 1, they care about the elasticity of the labor supply across labor markets. And this line represents kind of the optimal desired markdown for a firm that's changed the wage in a particular period. Now, suppose the monetary policy shock happens, because all firms, and there is no wage stickiness. In such economy, and if you have, suppose, only 3 firms, a small firm, a medium firm, and a large firm, with different level of productivities, all firms will change their wages proportionally, and the wage shares, the SIJ, the share within the labor market, will not change. And because of that, the markdown doesn't change, and because of that, the transmission of monetary policy to the wage is almost 1-to-1. There is full pass-through. Therefore, there is no heterogeneous response of monetary policy, despite the fact that these firms have labor market power. It's only when you have one firm that cannot change their wage in a particular period, in this case, this medium firm, where there is heterogeneous response. Intuitively, what is happening is that when monetary policy shock hits, and the firm in the middle cannot change their wage, the large and the small firm kind of compete for the workers of this firm, right? And they increase their wages in order to attract more workers. But the firm in the middle cannot change their wage. The wage bill goes down, the share goes down, so it moves to the left, and the workers that stay there kind of receive a higher markdown, and that it pushes that in that direction. But the important part is that that is what it generates the heterogeneous response now, because the large and the small firms are competing for these workers. So let me use just 30 seconds to show you the quantification. This is just our calibration. Let me show you only one plot. The model replicates the fact that low monopsony power firms are more responsive to high monopsony power firms. Just to conclude, let me show you that when you compare 2 economies, one economy in which is calibrated at the current levels of monopsony power in the United States, and one economy that is calibrated to the levels of monopsony power within a labor market and the 1980s, monetary policy is more responsive now than the 1980s, only from this mechanism. So I don't want to use more time. Let me just conclude. We document that low monopsony power firms are more responsive to monetary policy. We construct the neo-Keynesian model with heterogeneous and local firms. These guys compete, have some Calvo shocks. There is some issues about how we're solving this problem. I'm happy to talk about the kind of the intricacy of the quantification, but the model replicates this micro evidence that I show you. Because the oligopolistically competitive nature of our model, the fact that there is labor market power, that reduces the efficacy of monetary policy. The fact that there is a decline in local labor market concentration, it seems to have increased the efficacy of monetary policy around 16% in respect to how much they can affect output. Happy to answer more questions, but thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Sergio. And now we will pass on the virtual stage to Randy. So I think that Sergio, you need to share.
All right.
All right,
There
thank you
we
so
go.
much. Can you see my slides now?
We cannot.
Better.
We can now. Thank you so much.
All right,
right,
thanks.
now
Thanks so much to the organizers. Really, really pleased to be able to share this stuff with you. I have some co-authors, Josh Gillen at the board, Lara, my colleague here, and Hugh at the BLS. And we have an unusual disclaimer. We have the normal disclaimer, which uses our views, not the views of our employers, but there's a second one, the presentation from the BLS, by the way. The presentation provides a summary of research results, information being released. It's for statistical purposes to inform interested parties, and to encourage discussion of work in progress. Does not represent an existing or forthcoming official BLS statistical data product or production series. Right.
Hey, Randy, I think your microphone is cutting in and out. Is there any chance it got covered or something?
I don't see it covered.
Okay. All right, we'll keep trying then.
Okay. All right, so the motivation for this study is we're studying continuing tenant rents mainly, and rent is a key driver of inflation and consumption. So we really need to understand the dynamics of rent if we're going to understand inflation. And this is especially the case because of the OER approach to homeowner shelter costs that's taken in this country, many countries. And we think there's a surprising lack of attention to this in the literature. And one of the key things to just emphasize how important they are, rents drive 30% of the CPI and 18% of PCE, and they're very persistent. So here's some more motivation. When I'm plotting here at CPI rent, which is the same as PCE housing basically, and also the SFRI, which is a new tenant rent series in red. And you can see that the new tenant rent series leads, and is, you know, the CPI rent, CPI owners equivalent rent shelter costs are much more persistent than that. So why are they so persistent? This is a key topic in policy discussions right now. And it's, you know, we're going to argue and prove to you that this is really due to the dynamic of continuing tenant rent. But what are our contributions? We're using confidential CPI housing microdata, which is fantastic data for this kind of study. I'll explain, you know, a little bit more in a second. We quantify the importance of continuing tenant rents. That's new to the study. We also study their behavior vis-a-vis new tenant rents. We've got some interesting results along those lines. And, you know, one of the things we're looking at in this paper is what do standard models predict and where do they fall short? And one of our key findings I've kind of alluded to is the persistence comes from the fact that continuing tenant rents are often rigid. That's even if the Taylor Ferry allows you to change your price, a lot of times they don't change at all. And you're already paying the quote menu cost anyways because you're writing a new contract. So despite that, a lot of tenant rents remain completely rigid. And if they do change, they don't adjust all the way to the flex price rent. And then we explore the role of a rent gap, which is the difference between the actual rent that a continuing tenant is paying versus the hypothetical rent that unit would command if it was on the market for a new tenant. And this aggregate rent gap, I'll show you, varies over time. It's slightly elevated right now, but not super elevated. And we also demonstrate the role that this rent gap plays for both the extensive and intensive margins of price adjustment. So here's the data. It's the BLS housing survey that they use to collect rents for the CPI. It's about 40,000 rental units. These are surveyed every 6 months. And the survey follows the unit, not the renter. So you observe if a new tenant has moved into the unit. The data we have go from 1999 to the present. The units are divided into 6 panels. There's a January panel with surveyed in July. There's a February panel resurveyed in August, and so on. And this is a geographically representative sample by design. The data include the move-in date, the structure type, the number of rooms. Unfortunately, it does not have floor space. It's one of the things we don't have. They tell you if it's a rent-controlled unit or not. We have the aggregation weights that are used in the CPI. They ask about in-kind payments, et cetera. There's also data on structural changes to the unit, those kinds of things. And in the more recent data, we have contract length, so we don't have it for most of our sample. And in this study, we're using non-imputed contract rents adjusted for in-kind payments. So this is kind of what the person is paying the landlord, not the adjusted rent that might be used in the CPI. And then we have some additional data sources. We use the CoreLogic SFRI and data from CoStar to give us what the new tenant rent would be. I'll explain how we do that later. And then there's some other things we use for covariance for regression analysis. So the first thing I want to demonstrate to you is that continuing tenant rents dominate the CPI. We're going to ask, how can we figure out how important are continuing tenant rents for the overall CPI? And we estimated this in two ways. One is we just computed the aggregation weight. So like, what's the weight on continuing tenant rents? But you might have also worried, well, maybe, the weight is such and such, but it just turns out that on influence on the CPI, it's that's a misleading picture. So the second thing we did was we constructed new tenant and continuing tenant indexes and then just computed what's the implied weight for the CPI. It's a weighted average of those two. What's the weight that we come up with? And they give us basically the same answer as you'll see in that slide. So this I'm showing the figure for OER, but the figure for rent is pretty similar. And you can see, like the red line a bit smoother is just coming from the weights. 2003.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I think that if you can stand closer to the microphone,
okay, I'm sorry.
Be hearing you better. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try this. So the red line is showing what we get from computing weights. And you can see that this has risen actually from about 85% already in 2003 to 93% or so today. So you can see that continuing tenant rents are just dominant in terms of their influence on the CPI. And if we also have done a decomposition of the year-over-year rent inflation, just in different parts, and that just confirms this dominance. So this is a pretty solid fact. And this is really being driven by the change in this is being driven by declining renter mobility. So there's a higher share of units now that have continuing renters, and so they therefore have a bigger weight in the CPI. And this matters because continuing tenant rent dynamics differ a lot from new tenant rent dynamics, as I will show you. So the first fact I want to show you is just persistence from 100% nominal rigidity. So this slide is showing the distribution of rent changes by tenant type over 6-month periods. And you can see this huge spike at 0. And there's also downward rigidity. You can see that the right tail is, there's clearly piling up at 0 taken out of the left tail here. So an interesting fact, though, is that new tenant rents are also sticky, but continuing tenant rents are a lot stickier. And this is really clear evidence against kind of a null hypothesis model. I would think the Taylor model that, every 12 months you get this chance to change the rent, or maybe even more frequently you do. And yet a lot of rents don't even change in those periods. And I'll show you later when they do change, they don't change all the way to the new contract rent. Or new tenant rent, I should say. Let me show you a few facts about the extensive and intensive margins. This is the extensive margin of adjustment, namely, do rents change or not? If they do they go up? Do they go down? So the blue line is called the extensive margin, which is do they change at all? You can see that's not very cyclical. Now, there's a bit of an exception in COVID, but in general, it's not very cyclical. Conversely, there is a lot of cyclicality in switches from, say, rents going down to rents going up and vice versa. And then these swings are bigger for new tenants. You can see the continuing tenant ones, the switches are more subdued. And you can also see, over the recent period, there's been a decline in overall rigidity for both types. Now we move to the intensive margin, and this is plotting the median as well as, I think this is 1090 distribution of rent changes over time. So you can see that, there's a lot of dispersion here. There's a big role for idiosyncratic shocks, which I think is going to be important. And on the other hand, it's surprisingly acyclical. These price changes just don't change much, even though we've seen big changes in, rent movements over time. The size of these price changes is essentially flat, with a little exception in COVID, of course. But what's going on is a lot of similar to what Montag and Vilar showed. A lot of the action is coming from switching between an increase to a decrease or vice versa, not the intensive margin per se. And this level of idiosyncratic noise is going to play a key role, we think, in disciplining models. Now, there's a key heterogeneity, just to let you know. Single family is much stickier than apartments, and they're somewhat less sticky as well. Now I want to talk about incomplete adjustment. So this slide is showing an impulse response function of continuing tenant rents to a shock to new tenant rent. This is just a bivariate structural bar. And what we're showing here is the impulse response if you shock the new tenant rent, what happens to continuing tenant rent. So you can see that after 1 year, we get about 50% pass through, but it takes about 4 years to get 100% pass through. And there seems to be a lot of noise in the data. So that's the sense in which, adjustment is incomplete, and that's contributing to persistence. Now I bring you to the rent gap. I'm just going to show you a pictorial representation of how we compute a rent gap. So what we're computing is the difference between what the unit would rent for if it had a new tenant versus what it actually rents for right now. So what we do is when the rent resets, which is the point right here, we have a new tenant coming into the building. So we reset the R star, the hypothetical new tenant rent, to the actual rent of the structure, and then that rent is moved up by new tenant rents of its property type, which could be, if it's a detached unit, would be driven by a single family rent index or log index. So this would be sort of what we estimate as kind of what this unit would rent for if it was on the market. Here's its actual rent profile, and so the difference is the rent gap. And we winterize this at a plus or minus 6, which is about the 5th and 95th percentile of those. So if it's too extreme, we sort of squish it back in. So does this rent gap matter? Here's some findings we have. The rent gaps grow over a tenancy, just like the picture showed. So it's a bit puzzling, I would say. It's not a sit discount, it's a tenancy discount. So that's one of the questions that had been a question in real estate literature. Rent gaps, we demonstrate influence mobility and both the intensive and extensive margins. So there's state dependence in these price changes. Rent gaps, somewhat surprisingly, are often negative. Again, this suggests a large role for idiosyncratic shocks. Rent gaps right now are currently only slightly elevated on average, but they're actually, still fairly high for longer tenure units. And finally, larger rent gaps reduce the probability that a tenant moves, as you might expect, conditional on covariates. This slide here is just showing the rent gap distribution for a few years. The main thing I wanted you to get out of the picture is that there's a lot of weight on the left tail here for lots of negative rent gaps. So it's not always the case that the new tenant rent is above the continuing tenant rent. And in fact, in Japan, by the way, this would have more of the weight on this side, but we don't have Japanese data. I just happen to know that. Now here's a picture of the rent gap we estimate over time. We can estimate it using national level indexes. We could just use or we could use the city indexes for cities where we have data, or we could fill in. If we have a city with no data from SFI, for example, we can use the national rent gap for those. So that would give us 3 different lines here. You can see, it was quite elevated in the mid-2000s, came down before the pandemic, and then, of course, with the surges, it rose up. And now, it seems like if you measure it with only using national or filling in using national, we still have somewhat elevated rent gaps, maybe about 5%. If we just are only looking at the cities where we have data, maybe 2.5%, but that's where we are today in terms of the rent gap. Now, we did some regression analysis, just to demonstrate, okay, how important are these findings? The key coefficient here, the Y is either going to be, is the rent changing? Is it changing up or down? Or how big is the rent change, up or down? And the key coefficient we're looking for is beta. Does the gap, this should be an I on this, by the way, does the gap matter for that movement, either the probability of a change or the size of the change? We have city, property type, and time fixed effects, and a bunch of controls that you'll see in the slide. The controls we have on the left-hand side here, I just want to focus attention on the ones I have in red. Rent gap matters for the probability of rent change going up or going down in the way you would expect. The recent movements in that rent gap also matter a lot for the probability of going up or down. And in terms of size, again, the size of the rent gap, pushes things in the direction you might expect. So I think I'm out of time here, so let me just give you my conclusion slide. I want to say one thing from this slide. We think the facts are reconciled with standard sticky price theories. We've developed a new theory, which is based on implicit contracts. But in that case, you need a novel enforcement mechanism. And we're working on simulation evidence to explore counterfactuals. Thank you for your attention. Sorry to go over a little bit.
Thank you so much, Randy. And we can now officially open the Q&A session. So we'll get started with a question for Sergio. Did I understand correctly that wages were calvo and not downward rigid in your analysis? Do you think the interaction of monetary policy and oligopsony depends on whether shocks are positive or negative?
Yeah, should I answer right away? Yeah, Dominic, I mean, you're right. Like, it's only about the calvo. There is no downward rigidity in the model whatsoever. Whether or not interaction matters, whether the shocks are positive or negative, is something that we can check in the data. We have not done it. Monetary policy shock, even at the panel level, are hard to, I don't know. Like pull responses have these big standard errors. But we can definitely do it, and I can report back, or maybe in the paper where we have it. But we have not done it. But that would be something interesting to look at. In the model, though, everything is symmetric. There is no asymmetry in the model. So whether hit up or down, it wouldn't matter. It depends a little bit of where the distribution of firms are, but starting from a stationary distribution, the shock will be positive or negative, will give you the same result. But we can check in the data, and it's something we should do.
And I can maybe follow up with actually two questions for Sergio. So one is you said that basically you're setting this threshold of 10% that defines your low versus high monopsony power firms. So I wanted to understand a little bit better, where does that come from? And second, in the model, do you make any assumption on correlations between the distribution of wage stickiness and monopsony power? And what I mean by that is that, I can, basically think that wage stickiness is an endogenous outcome of monopsony power. So, and maybe that does not matter, but I just
let me start from the second. No, we don't do any correlation. Like firms, there is some calvo shock that makes your wage sticky, and whether you are a large firm, small firm, or a high monopsony, low monopsony, we don't do anything in the model. I think it's something important. We have been asked this before, but I mean, you guys may not know this literature much better. It's hard to come up with wage stickiness measures for large and small firms. I think it's something that we can do. We have some information from Denmark in my other projects that points to heterogeneous wage stickiness for large and small firms. So that is Denmark. It's a different country, so it's hard to come by, but it's something that we should look. Now, in terms of the data, we don't have much more information in the LEHD to try to understand wage stickiness itself. We don't have information of the contracts or some of the information, but it's something that we could look at. Finally, on the 10%, why we decide 10% was a little bit more of an heuristic. We have the distribution of firms, or the wage share of firms within a labor market. We say, well, what we find, for instance, is that 6% of all firms, 6% of all firms in the United States are defined as high monopsony power firm, and those account for around 33% of the wage bill and around 30% of employment. And that sounds for us like a reasonable number. If you have a different number, that is okay. Now, what we did, though, is to look at different thresholds, right? Yeah. Whether it's 10%, 5%, 15%, and we didn't get that out of the census, but there is a nice gradient to the extent, in the sense that if you start looking at the very big firms, suppose you compare those firms that have 5% of the local labor market versus the rest, the difference are significantly larger. So to the extent that you start focusing in the mega firms in the economy, you should see much of a difference between the high monopsony and the low monopsony power firm. But we don't have a theoretical way to think, oh, this should be 10% because, let's say, some estimate of the labor supply tell us that is more high monopsony power versus low monopsony power. I didn't have an idea, but yeah.
Thank you. And now a question for Andy from Dominic. Did your calculation of the rent gap include an implicit impact on OER?
So I think that's an interesting question. What we do is we compute the rent gap at the unit level. And then when we're aggregating that, we're not using aggregation weights either for rent or for OER. So in that sense, what you may be concerned about is for OER, say detached units would have a bigger weight. Detached units we would expect to have more rent gaps because they tend to have longer tenure tenants and stickier rents. So the rent gaps for OER may be bigger than the rent gaps for rent. That's a good question. That's something we should look into. So thanks for the question.
And then I have another question for Andy. So, I mean, to me, it's super interesting, right? That continuing contracts for continuing tenants are a lot more rigid than for new tenants. And I was wondering if there's, I mean, the idea of the landlords eventually seeing continuation value into their current tenants, whether that plays a role. And I think that you already saw this positive covariance or correlation between the rent gaps and the odds that current tenant will continue to stay will continue to rent that same unit.
Yeah. I mean, the surprising thing we found is that these rent gaps kind of get bigger over time on average. So you would think just to keep the tenant, I just have to keep it below market and that should be enough to keep them in, but it actually gets farther and farther. So, that makes me wonder if we, some other mechanism or what the mechanism is for that. Why is that an endogenous outcome? So like in the theory we're developing, for example, would be consistent with that actually, as it turns out, because what we're using there to enforce the implicit contract is the Rottenberg's idea of angry customers. And so the way he models it is you have the customers assume that the customers kind of insist that the landlord puts some weight on their utility when they're making the renegotiation changes, when they're making a new rent offer. And so that might, I haven't worked it out, but I think that might lead to this kind of very, very sluggish adjustment where, every time you get a rent reset, you just can't, move them all the way up because they might get pissed off and leave.
Can I ask something like, what is the role in this analysis to the owners or the institutions that own these houses? I mean, at the end, the rent is competing with the house price. And when they go and sign the value that you will get if you sell the house. So when this owner goes and negotiate the wage or the rent with the new tenant, right, is waiting, okay, what is the net present value of keeping a renter, anybody, versus just selling the house whatsoever? Is like over time, house prices are increasing. Is that what is behind about the changes in the gap?
So no, actually, this gap is just between sort of what the unit would rent for if it had a new tenant versus.
I understand, but the guy could just sell
Right.
the
So for
owner.
detached units are easy to move in and out of the rental market. So that's true
I
that
see.
for the detached units, what's going on with prices is going to be a key determinant one would expect. And that's an interesting thing for us to look into is, do we see, in the data, we might be able to find some evidence for that, consistent with that. Because in general, we see these, sort of what you might expect the opposite, which is detached units don't seem to do much, but maybe city by city wide, we might be able to pick up something. So thanks for the suggestion.
I mean, another, I guess, alternative is that conditional on the owner being decided that they're not going to sell the house, right? There might be some aversion towards ambiguity in the future. And so it's kind of a response to anticipated future uncertainty.
Right.
Just, an alternative.
Yeah, we'll think about that. Thank you.
Great, but there are no further questions. I think that we're right at about 11:45 now, so we'll end the session here. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Of course, many special thanks to Sergio and Randy for presenting such interesting work, and we look forward to seeing you in the next CEBRA webinar. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.